Welcome to my scientifically informed insider look at mental health topics. If you find this video to be interesting or helpful, please like it and subscribe to my channel. Hello, this is Dr. Grande. Today's question is, can I describe the difference between grandiose and vulnerable narcissism in terms of the fantasies? So, are there fantasy-based differences between these two types of narcissism? So this is really an interesting question because it gets into kind of the complex relationship between grandiose and vulnerable narcissism and narcissistic personality disorder. And it also kind of makes the argument that you can, in some sense, distinguish grandiose and vulnerable narcissism just by looking at fantasies. Now, I don't know if that's possible, but I have throughout my career seen a lot of differences in the fantasies. So there are certain themes I've seen with grandiose that you just don't see with vulnerable very often, and themes with vulnerable that you just don't see in grandiose too often. Now, of course, there is some overlap, and I'll talk about kind of these fantasy themes in this video. So first I want to cover what the differences are between grandiose and vulnerable and narcissistic personality disorder. So NPD, Narcissistic Personality Disorder, is a diagnosis in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. It's a cluster B personality disorder. And if you look at the symptom criteria for that disorder, it's mostly grandiose, but not necessarily all grandiose. So we see a grandiose sense of self-importance, fantasies of wealth, power, and success. The DSM says unlimited success, but it can really just be even exaggerated success. We see that somebody feels like they're special or unique. They require excessive admiration. They have a sense of entitlement. They tend to manipulate other people. They have a lack of empathy. They're jealous and arrogant. So those are the symptom criteria we see for NPD, and again, most of those relate to grandiose narcissism. Now, grandiose narcissism, we see characteristics like being extroverted, socially bold, self-confident, having a superficial charm, which is similar to what we see with psychopathy, being resistant to criticism, and being callous and unemotional, which is also similar to psychopathy. As we move over to vulnerable narcissism, we see shame, anger, aggression, hypersensitivity, a tendency to be introverted, so low on extroversion, defensive, avoidant, being anxious, depressed, and generally under distress, and also being socially awkward and shy. So grandiose and vulnerable narcissism are usually conceptualized as subclinical presentations, so they don't rise to the level of requiring treatment. They're not pathological. NPD, of course, by definition, is pathological. Now, if we look at vulnerable narcissism, and we start to think, okay, is it related to some personality disorder? Obviously, with that description, borderline personality disorder seems like it could be a correlate. But with vulnerable narcissism, again, we're talking about something that's subclinical. We wouldn't expect to see self-harm. We wouldn't necessarily see impulsive behavior with vulnerable narcissism. So it is a bit different than borderline personality disorder. Now, it is important to note, too, that I'm talking about grandiose versus vulnerable. Sometimes grandiose is called overt, and sometimes vulnerable is called covert narcissism. So there are some really interesting distinctions between the pathological side of narcissism and the subclinical. So with NPD, the personality disorder, we see overlap again between grandiose and vulnerable narcissism, and we see in individuals who have NPD, it's not unusual that they go from having grandiose narcissistic traits over to vulnerable traits. And sometimes they go from having vulnerable traits over to grandiose. So there seems to be oscillation there between the two states, between grandiose and vulnerable. Now, in both components, in both grandiose and vulnerable, even in the personality disorder, we see self-centeredness. That seems to be a symptom that's shared between those two different types of narcissism. Now, at the subclinical level, we see something a little different. We see that the constructs of grandiose and vulnerable narcissism seem to be somewhat distinct. And really the major difference seems to be on that extroversion trait. So we see, again, with grandiose, we see somebody who's extroverted, and with vulnerable, we see somebody low in extroversion or introverted. So here's one of the theories about how narcissism forms, like how the types form, and this is important for understanding the fantasy themes that I'm going to talk about in a moment. Extroversion as a trait develops before narcissism. That's one of the theories. So it could be that the same stressors that cause narcissism in general, like poor parenting and bullying, cause different types of narcissism based on the level of extroversion. So really, grandiose and vulnerable narcissism come from the same stressors, but these stressors are being put on somebody with a different level of extroversion. If somebody's extroverted, it turns into grandiose. If somebody's introverted, it turns into vulnerable. And one last key point here with these two types of narcissism. Vulnerable narcissism, research has shown that it can turn into narcissistic personality disorder, which again is mostly grandiose. Now this is actually a really important feature that we see with pathological, potentially pathological vulnerable narcissism, and this will tie in later on with the fantasy themes in kind of, I think, a really interesting way. So let's now talk about the fantasies. How are the fantasies different between vulnerable and grandiose narcissism? Well, again, this is an informal theory. This is just what I've noticed over the years, although there is some research to support kind of my theory here. I've seen some key differences in the fantasy themes. Now, narcissists in general like talking about fantasies. I actually view it as a way to help people that have vulnerable narcissism to kind of talk, to kind of get past the shyness, because when they're talking about fantasies, they usually will tell you a lot of information. Although I have noticed that sometimes they regret it later on. They feel self-conscious about revealing the fantasies. Now, grandiose narcissists, they typically get excited when explaining the fantasy, kind of intense and excited. We see that sometimes with vulnerable narcissism as well. So part of the difference is just in how somebody communicates the fantasy. So how about the fantasy themes? Well, I'm going to start with grandiose, and I'll take a look at vulnerable. So what I've noticed with grandiose narcissism is a lot of the fantasies are really expansions of pro-social goals. So they're like pro-social goals taken to the extreme. Now, I've also noticed that the fantasy themes in grandiose narcissism share a few important characteristics with vulnerable narcissism, and one of these is having access to sex. This is a popular fantasy theme regardless of the type of narcissism. The fantasies have something to do with having access to sex and romance. So again, that's shared between grandiose and vulnerable. So what distinguishes grandiose from vulnerable? Well, I have noticed that there's more of a future orientation with grandiose narcissism, so their fantasies are about something that they want to happen in the future. Now that might seem a little strange because you'd think all fantasies are about something in the future, but it turns out they're not, and I'll get to that when I talk about vulnerable narcissism. Now, kind of building on the pro-social goals, again, we see the grandiose narcissists want to achieve things that could be achieved, but they might be very unrealistic for whatever circumstances that person is in. So they may want to be the CEO of a company, or a famous athlete, or exceedingly rich, or be a celebrity, or obtain a higher rank in the same system where they are, but again, it's kind of unrealistic, right? So maybe if somebody's like a paralegal, they have a fantasy of being a judge. Or if they're in lower management in a company, they have a fantasy of being the owner of the company. Is it possible? Sure. Is it likely? In many circumstances, probably not. So that's why I think it's not really about unlimited success, especially with grandiose narcissism. It's about a great amount of success that's unrealistic. Here's another important point with grandiose narcissism. In a sense, the grandiose narcissist is already living their fantasy. Not the ultimate fantasy, but they're already kind of living a fantasy because of the high level of self-deception. They already view themselves as more successful, talented, and attractive. So in a sense, they're already living the dream. So the fantasies, again, are just expansions of what they already believe they have in terms of abilities and acquisitions and all that. They really just want more. Usually the fantasies aren't really divergent in a sense of like a different theme, like they want something completely different than what they have. They're usually lined up with what's going on with the narcissist at that time. Now we also see the grandiose narcissists are actually often successful in terms of their career and in other aspects and social aspects. So it's not a stretch to think that they could be more successful, at least for them. It makes sense that if they have some level of success, some of it's self-deception, some of it's real, that there would be more success. So why? Why do people who have grandiose narcissism tend to do so well? Well, I think part of it is they make good first impressions. I think another part is that socially dominant trait that can actually help people to succeed. High extroversion is associated with different types of success. We see this resistance to criticism. So somebody who has grandiose narcissism, they kind of look at criticism and just discard it. Even though that doesn't seem to be a great way to develop as a human being and to develop as a professional in a lot of ways, it could still be helpful. In some industries, in some fields, under some circumstances, being able to ignore criticism is an advantage. Also, they tend to manipulate people. I mentioned that, so that could lead to success, even though it's not pro-social. That part's not pro-social. And we also see a lot of self-confidence. And I think this is one of the big keys of success with grandiose narcissism. Just an abundance of confidence, more than enough to handle a lot of situations and impress people. There's an actor named Woody Allen, and I'm not necessarily a fan of Woody Allen, but he has a quote that I like. 80% of success is showing up. Well, if somebody has grandiose narcissism, they're very confident they are going to show up. They're going to be there. They're going to go for the interview, try to get the interview. They're going to apply for the job. They're going to pursue an education. They're going to show up. They may not be good necessarily at whatever they're doing, but they will show up. And again, that's 80% of success. So that covers the grandiose narcissism fantasy themes. What about the vulnerable? What about in the vulnerable side? Well, here, one of the major kind of themes that I see is the theme of rejection and redemption. So this can occur in the past, the present, and just like grandiose narcissism, it can also be future-oriented. One of the common things I see with vulnerable narcissism that I don't tend to see with grandiose is re-scripting events in the past. So having fantasies about what they could have done. For example, again, we know bullying tends to lead to vulnerable narcissism. And of course, it can lead to grandiose narcissism. So the vulnerable narcissist might have a fantasy where they go back to when they were bullied, except this time they beat up the bully, right? So they re-script it, almost like might occur in therapy. Of course, that wouldn't be a therapeutic goal, any type of violence, but some therapeutic goals involve kind of re-scripting the past with certain modalities. That's kind of what these fantasies do in a sense. Now, I don't think it's, again, in a healthy way, but it is what we see. We see this re-scripting. We also see a theme of revenge, like righting the wrongs, which is kind of like the re-scripting part, but not necessarily in a violent way. So I'm going to give an example here of a vulnerable narcissistic fantasy that I think really kind of ties this together. It ties in the rejection, the redemption, but also kind of a desire for revenge at the same time. So when people are younger, it's not unusual, of course, that they date. And of course, people of any age can date. But we know that dating is strongly associated with being young, like late teens, 20s, early 30s. And during dating, a lot of rejection occurs. A lot of people are rejected, and a lot of people do the rejecting. And normally this is somewhat balanced. Normally when somebody's dating, they're going to go out on dates and they're going to get rejected, and other dates, they're going to be the one that would reject somebody. Now, some of the decisions that younger people make in terms of dating might be different than we see with people who are middle-aged or older. Not necessarily, but sometimes. For example, we see this theory that younger individuals focus more on attractiveness, popularity, and convenience, right? So on the convenience part, they might not have a car, for example, so they have to date who they can get to. Now, as people grow older, things that may have mattered when they're younger tend to matter less, right? A lot of those factors tend to change in terms of mate selection. And what becomes more important might be something like a good personality match, finding somebody who's sensitive, or financial security. So the criteria that someone who's young uses when dating, again, in some circumstances seems to change as they grow older. And this sets up an interesting situation for the vulnerable narcissist. As they have fantasies about rejection and redemption, they can think back to the people that rejected them when they were younger. And again, thinking about the criteria that they used for mate selection. And they know that this could be 5 years later, 10 years later, or even 40 or 50 years later. They know that the criteria for mate selection now would be different. And that potentially the person that rejected them when they were younger may regret that rejection if they knew what kind of person that the vulnerable narcissist turned into. So this fantasy is kind of based on one of these people that rejected the narcissist, encountering them in some situation and seeing how great they are, seeing how wealthy they are, seeing if they have expensive automobiles or an expensive house or a great job or whatever. Something so they can kind of think to themselves, well, I proved them wrong, or I'll show them, right? They rejected me and now I'm successful and now they regret that decision. And of course we know that's not usually how people look at it, even moving into the future. Even if somebody did reject someone else when they're young, they would still likely reject them in the future, even if circumstances have changed. But again, we're talking about fantasies here. And this is a fantasy that kind of weaves in, again, rejection, redemption, and revenge. Now, I think this is a really interesting fantasy because we kind of see this fantasy played out in a lot of movies, right? You'll see, for example, a guy who's shy and gets bullied and has all kinds of social awkwardness. And by the end of the movie, he beats up the bad guys and he saves the town, right? And the love interest, or the potential love interest that had rejected him, now those love interests like him a lot. So in a sense, we see kind of the vulnerable narcissism fantasy themes played out in a lot of movies. And this isn't really surprising to me because we're talking about subclinical vulnerable narcissism, and we know that characteristics like hypersensitivity and shyness and being socially awkward are distributed among the population. So a lot of people can connect with the vulnerable narcissistic fantasy theme. So again, that kind of explains why we see it in the media. Now, the last fantasy theme I'll talk about here ties back to a point I made earlier. I think this is really particularly interesting. Another fantasy I see with vulnerable narcissism is a fantasy of changing their personality traits to be more outgoing, dominant, and confident. So in a sense, one of the fantasy themes is becoming a grandiose narcissist. Now, I think this is so interesting because we know that when somebody has extreme vulnerable narcissism, sometimes that converts over to grandiose narcissism in the form of narcissistic personality disorder. I mentioned that before. So what I observed kind of through clinical practice in terms of these fantasy themes actually connects back to what the research has indicated. So I think it's kind of an interesting loop that was closed there in terms of narcissism. And when I was thinking about it for this video, it really struck me as something that was really interesting and made a lot of sense as I put the pieces together. Now, I know whenever I talk about narcissism and fantasy themes in other areas, there are going to be a lot of different opinions. If you agree or disagree with some of the comments I've made in this video or have other opinions, please put those in the comment section for this video. As always, I hope you found this description of narcissism fantasy themes to be interesting. Thanks for watching.